everyone who registered, which is not necessarily everyone who's coming tonight. So, so it's going to go out fairly broad once we're finished with it. And there's also closed captionings here, so you can enjoy the closed captionings if you have any kind of audio issues. Alrighty, so my name is Alicia Keenan, everyone, and I am a board member of the Volusia Flagler chapter of the Florida ACLU, and I am also on the Racial Justice Committee. We of the Racial Justice Committee are the ones putting together the speaker series, and we're very excited to have Dr. Janina Jeff with us tonight. Through a series of events, it turns out that I'm running the entire show by myself tonight. So please bear with me as I'm allowing people to come in and talking to you and so forth. And we will start very, very soon. But right now, people are still coming in quickly, so which is good. It's a good thing. We want people to come in great numbers. So Janina, where are you geographically?
I am actually in New York right now.
Okay, so you're in the same time zone, yeah?
I'm in the same time zone, but I recently relocated to New Orleans, which is where I'm originally from.
Okay, I love New Orleans. I haven't been there in years, but they unfortunately just got another hit.
Yeah, so I actually evacuated as a part of the last.
Oh, did you? Oh gosh, did you sustain any damage?
No, I just didn't have power. So then I decided to
me.
Everyone, please mute yourself. That would be great. And set your settings at the top right to speaker view. That'll give you the best view of our speaker tonight. All righty. Yes, we get our share of hurricanes here in Central Florida as well, but this year so far, knock on wood, so hopefully we'll be fine. So it's 6:32. People are still coming in. I'm going to go ahead and can you guys can't hear that ding dong, can you? No ding dong? Okay, good. Then that's just me. Then that just alerts me that people are coming in. So I'm going to welcome you all to tonight's speaker series with Dr. Janina Jeff. I will do a quick intro, if you will. Janina Jeff is the first African-American to receive a PhD in human genetics from Vanderbilt. She is the host of In Those Genes, a podcast that uses genetics to decode the lost histories and futures of African descendants. And I'll put that link to her podcast in the chat as well. So let some more people in here. Janina is also a TEDx alum, a STEAM advocate, Afrofuturism enthusiast, a hip hop nerd, and a fearless explorer of the world, which I love because I'm that too. The intersectionality of these qualities and interests have given Dr. Jeff a unique perspective to the community, defying traditional stereotypes of what creatives and scientists represent and dispelling misinformation around COVID-19 and genetics in the Black community. So welcome, Janina. We're really excited to have you here. I just want to tell you really quickly that I actually heard Dr. Janina Jeff on the NPR science podcast. I just left my brain. What's it called?
Shortwave.
Shortwave, thank you. Yes, which I listen to every day, actually, I should remember. And I was riveted by what you were talking about. So that led me to reach out to Dr. Jeff and ask if she would be willing to please speak for our speaker series. So we're going to start right now. I would like to ask you all again to mute your microphones. And Janina Jeff, please take it away.
Yes, I'm going to go ahead. So, hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you. I have been really excited about ACLU. I've joined now, I think about 3 years ago. And it's just, nice to be in a room with people who have been doing great work, who are extension of some of the things that I work and care about and am interested in. So, super honored to be here with you. I am going to talk to you a lot about my work as a scientist and podcaster, and really kind of center the conversation on, kind of walking through what genetics is, what are we studying, how do we study genetic ancestry, and talk a lot about the podcast. And so you'll hear a lot of clips throughout my talk. And I would like to end with some discussion. I would like to hear and answer some questions around things that you might be interested in, curious about, thoughts that have crossed your mind. And just have a conversation. And so first, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about what I do and just kind of give a nice little explainer and foundation. I'll be talking a lot about my personal views on the intersectionality of being a Black woman in science as well, and the history, which might be somewhat redundant since you've had some speakers talk about medical racism, of racism, particularly as it is shown in my field, which is genetics. I think someone is maybe not on mute. So before I get started, I just want to remind, and I don't know if Alicia, if you have the capability, but you should, if you're the host, you can mute people if it happens.
I am muting people as they're like speaking up. So everyone, if you haven't heard that yet, please mute yourself so that we don't get any other noises in the background. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Which, with Zoom, sometimes you can see everything and sometimes you can't. Okay. Hopefully you can see my slides though. Okay, cool. Please interrupt me if you cannot see my slides, but I think you all can all see them. Okay. So I call myself a geneticist, and a lot of people are, this is a play upon words, I should say, that really speaks to kind of me living what I like to call a double consciousness, which is this idea that I, revere the power of the genome and understand the infinite possibilities that it holds for the future of human health. And that would be my more formal title as a scientist in genetics and working at a company like Illumina that is a leader in genetics. And then the other side in this picture is kind of like, who I am on the weekends, right? The other side really kind of thinks about the cis part. And, even though I understand genetics and the possibilities that genetics holds for our future, I am still a Black woman with a lived experience. And so I am very much so conscious of the lack of ethical research and compassion for the Black community. And really what I'm focused on and working on is how I can use what I like to call as, my double consciousness to really change that. So I talked about this word, the genome. Throughout this talk, I'll be playing clips of the podcast where I explain what certain things are. Oh, and actually, let me stop really quick because every time I share my screen, I always forget to optimize the sound and video. So I'm going to do that really quickly and then go back. So hopefully you can all hear the video play. So let's start with what is the genome and what does the geneticist even do? And genes are what make us us. So everybody has the same genes. As much as we try to think one person has a gene for this and the other person has a gene for that, we all have the same 25,000 genes. But what makes it different are the 4 letters that make up these genes, and that's called DNA. So those 4 letters, or these 4 chemicals, are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And for short, we call them A, T, C, and G. And so the sequence of these letters is what makes one gene different from the next gene. And within the same gene, you can have a different sequence between different individuals. So I told you guys we're 99% the same. So we have the same genes, but some of our genes may have an A where someone else has a T. And that's what makes us different from each other. Now, genome is a term that refers to your entire gene pool. Now we're talking about all 25,000 genes. We use it as a cohesive term to distinguish it from talking about a particular gene per se. For the sake of explanation, think about your genome as a bowl of rice. The entire bowl is your genome, and every spoonful are your individual genes. So we know each bowl of rice has 25,000 spoonfuls or genes. So that's an explanation of what a genome is. And now, in that clip, I had mentioned that we are 99% the same. And I was actually referring to it in the episode. So I hadn't told you that yet, but we are 99.9% the same as humans. And really, when we think about genetics and we think about the letters that make up this genome, I like to think about the genome as a book, right? We share so many letters with other species. And so in this example, I have this adorable picture of me as a kindergartner, and the different species that I share commonalities, and you do too, with your genome. And so as humans, we share about 98% of our genomes with chimpanzee. We share about 92% with mice, and this makes sense because both of these are mammals. And as we go further away from species, we share less and less. But you'd be surprised to know that we still share a considerable amount of our genome with plants. I was actually on a podcast where I talked about how much of our genome we share with bananas. So we share a lot of our genomes with things that you wouldn't expect. It's such a crazy idea that genetics has been used to create this divide between humans because we actually share 99.9% of the same genome. And just to illustrate an example of what that looks like, if we were to look at these three women, they all appear to look different, right? But if we were to actually look at their genome, they look pretty identical. And when I'm giving and I'm talking about, I bring this slide up to little kids, I always like to ask them to find the one difference between their genomes. And so what I'm showing you for each person are the letters that make up a portion of their genome. And it all, first glance, looks like they could be identical. But if you look closely, there actually is one area where they vary. And so these areas, we call them single nucleotide polymorphisms, exist all across the genome. And it's really what I do as a population geneticist in trying to understand what differences are between people who look different. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do we talk about this in the context of family and ancestry? Well, obviously, when we're looking at this picture, Lupita, Cardi B, and Taylor Swift are different. They have different parents. They come from different families. That means that they have different common ancestors. And so when we think about how do we describe our DNA, when we start to talk about ancestry, what we're really describing is this connection to the way we look, or something that we call in genetics a phenotype, and how that is represented from our ancestors. And so in this example, I'm showing Sasha Obama, and I am showing her, basically her, the DNA that would represent in this example, if she would have a straight or hitchhiker thumb. So I like to tell everyone, we can do this exercise really quick. Everyone put their thumb up and see if you have a hitchhiker or a straight thumb. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation of other people on this call who have a hitchhiker thumb or a straight thumb. And I always show like, I have a bone straight thumb, which is like so rare to me. But in this example, we can start to think about these phenotypes. They all descend from our most common ancestors. And when we think about our most common ancestors, that's who we're trying to describe these shared traits that we have with different people as genetic ancestry. So genetic ancestry is a very broad term that can go hundreds of years back to our ancestors, where they first started off on various continents before traveling over water was possible, to even our more recent common ancestors like our parents. And so that really is what the study of population genetics is, and that's the study of what I do. But a lot of people ask, well, how do you get all of this variation? And how is it that people who have the same parents might look different? And that kind of gives this extra layer of complexity. We said that we're all 99.9% the same. And yet we use things like race to divide how we look. And even in this picture, you can't really predict how your thumb is going to be just by your appearance. You can make guesses, which is what we typically do. But there's no way of knowing, right? Because you can have a straight thumb and your brother or your sister could have a completely different thumb, right? You can be one skin complexion and your brother or your sister could have a completely different skin complexion. And all of that is due to this process that we call recombination. So I'm going to play this clip to kind of explain with an analogy. And this is how I use Black culture to kind of explain genetics.
Now, my great grandfather, your complexion or even lighter. His name was William Spencer Short. And his wife was darker than your father.
Also the opposite. So the female was darker.
The female was darker. Now, they had a big family, but none of their children were ever fair-skinned. They were all dark-skinned. So, which kind of like, okay, well, maybe this man could be my grandfather because of his father being so fair-skinned. But then I just, it just had that question mark because my mother, I mean, if I showed you a picture of my mother, you would say she was white.
So it's interesting because you have made this hypothesis. One of the cool things about genetics is that when two parents come together and they have offspring. So what I'm trying to explain to my mom is this idea of recombination. You could think about this in the context of a deck of cards. So in a typical deck of cards, you have 52, but in your genome, you have 46 chromosomes. You get 23 of them from mom and 23 from dad. So if you have these two separate decks, when they come together and you shuffle them, they make a unique order of cards. And this unique order of cards still has the same origin, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. But every time you shuffle them, you get a different order of these cards. So, for example, when you have siblings, you all have the same origin. You still have the same 46 chromosomes coming from the same parents. But the different order is what makes you separate from your brother or from your sister. So remember, every shuffle that you do is completely random. There's no way to predict what order the cards may come in. So each sibling is going to look different, or they could look exactly the same.
So that's how we talk about all this variation that exists. So this idea of race, if we think about recombination, we think about all of these changes that could happen just with people who you are even closely related to. There's no way to characterize an entire group of people from just a physical representation, because as we know, that physical representation could look like our parents, but it's likely going to be a combination of that. There's no way to really predict it. And it can be different with people who even have the same parents. So how do we get access to this information? How do we start to describe our DNA and start to understand how do we get to genetic ancestry? Well, this is a process that requires us to get DNA samples. How do we even actually get access to our DNA? So if you've ever heard of 23andMe and Ancestry.com, they all do this. They all give you a report that talks about your genetic ancestry, your most recent common ancestors. They tell you who you're related to. And now they're even starting to give you prediction on disease risk. And they do all of this because they have access to your DNA, and they're able to take your DNA and translate something like a spit sample, as you see in this example, to the letters that we talked about that make up our genome. And so without going into too much detail, you spit in this tube, we can extract the DNA from this tube. So you can see this here. And we basically make a bunch of copies. We make a bunch of copies of this little sample that you send us, and then we cut it up. We cut it up in a bunch of different pieces. And once we cut it up into different pieces, we apply it to what we call a genotyping array. And so my job at Illumina is to create these genotyping arrays. The point is that we take your DNA, we cut it up, and we put it on this chip. And it will bind to this chip, and it will tell us if it has a match for different various types of what we call genotypes or representation of your DNA. And so every part of your genome, you can have the option of having 2 copies of one letter one copy of each letter or two copies of a completely different letter. And that's kind of how we characterize and we kind of be able to quantify these letters that make up these different phenotypes. Now, the really complex thing, and I won't even go into this level of detail, is that for one phenotype, there can be thousands of these just letters, and you have to computationally pull them all together and make a hypothesis or conclusion around how the phenotype or the physical representation is manifested from these letters. If we were to think about something like race or skin color, there are, again, thousands and thousands of places in the genome that this can happen. And not only that, you have to think about the many different combinations, like we talked about recombination, that would produce a given skin color, right? So this is by no way an easy process. And this was a very technical explanation. So I'm going to give you a podcast explanation.
All right, so tell me what it was like from ordering the test to getting your results.
So yeah, it was. I think the price had dropped to like from like $100 something to $75 or something like that.
So you out here checking for $24?
Yeah,
All
I'm
right.
looking for the that's how you get me.
Yeah, I think ours was 100 for 2, so it was crazy.
Oh, okay.
It
So
was
they
really
really out
cheap.
here cutting deals.
Yeah. That was a hell of a deal.
Then it comes in the mail.
It was like a special little box, right? You
Okay.
open the box. It was cool because you open the box, it had a cool little presentation. It was like a
It
kit.
was a cool presentation.
It was like a kit. It was like a kit. You just pop open like,
It was
oh,
like a
this is
Coachella
cool.
box.
Right, exactly. It was like,
Kinda
it was. It was.
And how do you actually give a DNA sample?
So you spit.
How much spit are we talking here?
It was
Like 6 ounces, 4 ounces, maybe not even. Like a
not
little
that much. It was a 2,
ounce.
so it was like
That's a lot of spit.
it was like 3 spits. I felt like. Personally, having done samples from saliva before,
It's not fun.
it's not fun.
So
number
saliva
one.
is not the best way
It's
to
not.
isolate DNA.
Oh, this is not high yield. I was like,
So there are several ways to get a DNA sample. DNA is in each one of the cells that make up the human body. Most common forms of samples include blood, saliva, hair, sperm, and even skin. But they do not all give the best quality DNA. The best way to extract DNA is from a blood sample. But obviously, this is not something you would do on your own for an ancestry test. So what you do is you spit. While this method does not yield a lot of DNA, after extraction, the data quality is good enough. Once there is enough DNA extracted, we can replicate the DNA and store it for future use, which is called biobanking. So after you spit, you ship it out, and then what?
You said it took like 6 to 8 weeks or something to get it back.
And while you were waiting, what results did you think you were going to get? Or what results were you hoping to get?
I wanted a little bit of Ghana.
Why?
I wanted,
What kind of Ghana?
just because I think Ghanaians are dope. I feel.
So that's an explanation of, and I should be giving you guys more context. I'm just like going through this and not giving you all the context, but, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to play that again. The first, and I'm going back in clips, but these are clips, and as you can see on the slide, it tells you which episode it's on. This particular clip were two of my friends, both of them who are physicians, talking about getting their genetic ancestry test and that experience and how that experience was for them. And talking about, how the test worked. Now, the biggest question that I get almost all the time is how accurate are these tests? A lot of people do them. You have a lot of options. If you're interested in hearing about the options that you have in order to do genetic ancestry testing, you can go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, which you should do already anyway. And we have various episodes, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But I wanted to talk about how accurate the test is. And we talk about this in detail in episode 3, but I give this explanation when I gave a TEDx talk in 2019. And it really is more of a cultural explanation of how accurate the test can be and some of the things that you should know about when you're taking these tests. So we know how the tests work. We know why we want to do the test, right? We want to translate our DNA into something that we can understand and something that we can either make assumptions about in terms of our disease risk, which I think is the most powerful part about it, or we've also seen it be abused to think about things like the creation of race, which I'll talk about later. But how accurate is this?
Once you send in your DNA, companies compare your data with other samples in their database to find similarities. Then they report to you how similar your data is with the samples from across the world. So if you can imagine, where there is a lack of representation in the world, where you are from, what you get is the next best match, which is a reflection of the samples they have, but might not be your actual genetic ancestry. However, as companies add more data from across the world and redo the analysis, your match might change from the original prediction to a better prediction that might be more accurate. So the Black culture parallel would be something like going to a cookout and everybody brings salad. Now, yes, salad is good. And in this example, salad is still food, but it doesn't fully represent the food pyramid for a complete meal. In the context of genetics, here, once you send in your DNA, companies compare your data with similarities. Then they report to you how similar your data is, where there is a lack of representation in the world, where you are from. What you get is the next best match, which is a reflection of the samples they have, but might not be your actual genetic ancestry. However, as companies add more data from across the world and redo the analysis, your match might change from the original prediction to a better prediction that might be more accurate. So the Black culture parallel would be something like going to a cookout and everybody brings salad. Now, yes, salad is good. And in this example, salad is still food, but it doesn't fully represent the food pyramid for a complete meal. In the context of genetics, here the salad would be European genomes. Still human, but doesn't represent world populations. But if different types of people come to the cookout, they will bring different foods that explain their lifestyle, culture, and thus diet. Then we start adding proteins like chicken and carbs like my infamous crawfish bread. This cookout starts to resemble a better representation of the food chain. The more people we invite, the more diverse the menu becomes. I mean, just think about the rice table. We got plain rice, jambalaya, paella, jollof, shrimp fried rice, basmati rice, literally a global representation. Now the cookout goes from a salad bar to a full-blown Brooklyn block party just by being inclusive. So, like the cookout, the more genomes we add to the database, the more accurate the database is at reflecting human populations across the world.
So that's an example of, well, that's me with a very a culturally relevant example of how accurate these tests are. And so I think from this point, we have a pretty good sense of how the tests work, how accurate they are. I didn't go into detail about the different types of tests and what they offer, but I'll be more than happy to answer questions on that. The most difficult part, I would say, about my career and working in this space is that I really do believe in genetics. And I really do believe that genetics holds a big place in our future, especially in the future of medicine. However, when we're talking about something like genetic ancestry tests, despite me being a scientist that actually develops the tests that we use in order to predict genetic ancestry, I still battle with my double consciousness. And for those of you who are not familiar with a double consciousness, it was coined by W.E.B. Du Bois. And what he was describing was this experience of having two lived Black experiences. In my case, one of them is just literally what I talk about as a geneticist, where I am a scientist. I believe in genetics. I, research genetics. I've been studying genetics now for over 15 years. And the other side of, the painful past of genetics and dealing with this conflict of knowing that the history of genetics was not always a positive thing. And so I'm going to talk about the history of genetics. But before I do, I also want to say that being a Black woman and being a Black geneticist and understanding this complex double consciousness has made me think about genetic testing in a completely different way. So despite being a person who develops genetic tests for a living, I actually have never done one. And I really don't think that I am at a place where I feel comfortable enough in doing one. And that's just to say that everyone's experience with genetic testing can be different. And of course, I want to empower and encourage you all to think about what that might feel like for you. But as a Black woman, especially as being a Black woman with fair skin, when I think about my most recent common ancestors, it is a painful experience because I'm thinking about the sexual violence that some of my ancestors might have endured that might explain my fair skin. And so I bring that up because a lot of times in the scientist community, and even when we talk about the vaccines, there is this huge push to have Black Americans, or just really all non-white individuals, be more open and trusting of science, right? And we're not acknowledging and understanding how painful science might be for people who have endured some type of oppression. And so if you're not already familiar with Brittany Packnett Cunningham, you should definitely follow her and listen to her work. She used to be on a podcast that was called Pod Save the People. And anyway, she talked about this a couple of years ago when ancestry.com released a commercial that really romanticized slavery. And it depicted a Black woman running away with this white man to Canada and they were in this love, it was a love story. And that was Ancestry's pitch to Black Canadians to go do some testing. It was horrific. And in fact, we talk about it on episode 6 of the podcast. I won't play a clip from that today, but I just want to say that lived experience is very different. And so having this double consciousness, I'm learning a lot even about genetics. And one of the things that I learned in my PhD was this idea of the HeLa cells. And so HeLa cells were something that I was very familiar with as a young scientist in undergraduate and graduate school, because HeLa cells are immortal cells. They are a human cell line that is really used in almost every cancer biology lab. In fact, HeLa cells have been used for a lot of things, which I'll talk about. But I was even a little traumatized to know that as a scientist, I didn't know the history behind the name HeLa cells, which came from Henrietta Lacks. And for those of you who are not familiar with Henrietta Lacks, I like to call her the original geneticist. And so I'm going to just play a little clip of her story. And then I'm going to talk about the things that, in this clip, you'll hear me talk about the things that her contribution to science was.
It was 1951 in Baltimore, Maryland. A young woman, Henrietta, was experiencing severe vaginal bleeding. Trusting the only facility at that time that treated poor African Americans, she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital, desperate to stop bleeding. In addition to providing care for Mrs. Lacks, the physician noticed something about her cells. They didn't die. Instead of getting her consent to study the cause of her immortal cells, he decided to steal them without her consent. The only credit he gave her was naming the cells an abbreviated version of her name, HeLa cells. Today, this is the most common human cell line that exists in research labs. Her cells are in part responsible for the eradication of polio, creating HPV vaccines, sequencing the human genome, and understanding diseases like cancer, HIV, and so much more. Mrs. Lacks died at 31. And it isn't until recently that the story on the misuse of her data has come to light. And while her family has been compensated with some money, Mrs. Lacks didn't have the option or privilege to consent to the use of her data. But we do. We have the privilege to consent. Many of us have the privilege to read and the privilege to research and use powerful tools like the internet to understand these T's and C's. And many of us have the ability to help out those in our community who can't read and research. We've experienced a long history of having things done to us without our say. And while institutional BS still inflicts oppression on us day in and day out, I want us to at least be able to arm ourselves with the tools to become authors of our own stories. Don't let companies do things with your genome without your true consent. Read them T's and C's, fam.
So that, what I'm really explaining is I don't know why it's doing that. A personal experience of learning about this Black woman later on in my science career and hearing the story of how she contributed to science without her consent. I'm grateful. We all should be grateful for Henrietta Lacks, because without Henrietta Lacks, I wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't even be studying the genome, because we wouldn't even know that we had 23 chromosomes. Without Henrietta Lacks, we wouldn't have a lot of vaccines. But there still is this complexity and this conflict of how having this contribution to science have saved so many lives. But there was one life that was lost. There was one life that was taken advantage of. And this is something that when I think about my ancestors and the Black women who came before me, this was something that was our past. When we think about Black women, when we think about Black people and our first encounter with the medical industry, medical system or medical care, most of us and our ancestors who came over to America only got to see a physician in 1 or 2 scenarios. The first scenario was that you were so sick that you had to work. And because we know slavery is driven by capitalism, getting you back out into the field is extremely important. The other is that you were, basically subjugated in scientific research without your consent. And unfortunately, this was a very common thing. And it's not something that is so far in our past. What I'm showing in this picture here is a Black woman, and this is a regenerated picture of Dr. J. Marion Sims, who is thought of as the father of gynecology. And up until 2018, he had a statue that was standing tall at Mount Sinai Hospital, back where I did my postdoc. And he was known as the father of gynecology for all of the medical research and advances that he put forth in gynecology. And a lot of that work was done at the expense of Black women, particularly doing procedures on Black women without anesthesia under the assumption that they can endure more pain. And I bring that up because when we start to think about how we engage in these communities and we start to think about what we think is our distant past, it actually is a part of our future. I even myself today in 2021, as much as I work in medicine and as much as I have friends who also work in medicine, when we get sick, we still don't instinctively think or even have the privilege to think that I could have some type of preventative care. That mindset of going to the doctor when you're so sick that you can't work, or in a scenario where there's some type of incentive, in this case, in speaking of 2021, these are the scenarios in which we have gone to the doctor. And unfortunately, because of that, it starts to exacerbate more health disparities. But we have to really own that this is not necessarily something that's a part of our distant past, that this is something that is very much so present, but it is something, in particularly my field of genetics, was founded under the idea of a pseudoscience called race. And so in our first episode in season 2, we talk about this. We talk about how the world inherited Blackness. And so in this clip, we are talking about the origins of genetics as a field. And where did it come from?
As defined by Galton, eugenics was the study of all agencies under human control, which can improve or impair the racial quality of future generations. And the goal was to have superior humans mate with one another to breed out inferior humans. He was a racist who was trying to kill off all non-white people. And there was a bunch of people on board openly identifying as eugenists. But then, in the early 20th century, when real life science, that is, genetics, rolls around, a shift happens.
Very many departments, programs, institutions, and even professorships of genetics today, they just renamed from like this institution's department of eugenics became this institution's department of genetics. This professor of eugenics became this professor of genetics.
So all this genetics is trash? We got to cancel the whole show?
So while genetics itself, I would not argue is racist, these theorists and practitioners maintained former practices and ways of thought.
Science is as socially and politically constructed as any other field. What all of these colonialism era, European empire era thinkers and scientists, et cetera, show us is that really all of these disciplines can be corrupted to make really wrong assessments in the service of European white supremacy.
So this is the basis of genetics. Genetics started like that. And also a part of genetics is this idea of racism. So racism, the idea of race, was actually born through what we now call the Department of Genetics, the field of genetics, right? This idea of eugenics just really just descended into something that we now call genetics. And so it makes you, as a person who experiences this discrimination, start to think about, well, what other things have we called science that aren't really science? As we know that race is a pseudoscience. And as I explained earlier in the beginning, that there's no way for us to say that race is genetic. We can't really, no one can say that because race is simply created. But there are a lot of other baseless facts. And these baseless facts have led to a lot of distrust between the Black community and in medicine. And so some of them are still being used today. So for example, I have these 8 baseless facts in the era of scientific racism that have kind of shaped where we are today. I'll just talk about the ones that I think are the most important for where we are right now. One of them is when it comes to the lung capacity, that the deficiency in the Negro is 20%. A spirometer, which is still currently used in medicine today, still operates under this notion that there is a deficiency in Black people at 20%, right? We still also hear a lot of Black women, if we talk about female mortality, fetal birth mortality rate, and birthing rates between Black women and other women is 200 times higher in Black women. And a lot of this is that when Black women, even prominent Black women like Serena or Beyonce, go to the doctor, their concerns about their pain and their issues are not being heard. And so these things still exist. One of them that was a surprise to me to find out when we were reporting on COVID-19 was that Black people were, this idea that US physician Benjamin thought that Black people were immune to yellow fever. And so when the yellow fever epidemic was happening, particularly there's a story about this happening in Philadelphia, where everyone started to get sick and white people were getting sick and the Black people were not getting sick. There was this assumption that Black people were immune to yellow fever. Therefore, while everyone else evacuated to quarantine themselves from yellow fever, it was asked that the Black people stay to nurse those who were ill. And of course, what happened was that those Black people then developed yellow fever and suffered as well. And so I bring that last one up because when we start to talk about COVID-19 in the very beginning of the pandemic, we as a podcast also dealt with this because the media at the very beginning, there weren't reports on Black people getting COVID-19. And this happened for maybe like a week or two. And in that week or two, Black people started to get excited. Hey, we're not getting COVID. You know, we were all everyone was on social media making these scientific claims that Black people were immune to COVID-19. And so we at the podcast really shifted what we talk about on the podcast to COVID-19. And we address these concerns because we want to make sure that we're reporting the science, that we are also being very transparent. Because like I just told you, there are so many errors within science. Everything is not fact. Everything is very dynamic. And when we're thinking about COVID-19, it is constantly changing. And so that narrative of Black people being immune to COVID-19, we did reporting on that and we predicted, and unfortunately this happened, that not only were Black people not immune to COVID-19. In fact, when we get COVID-19, it becomes a more severe case of COVID-19 because of the already existing systemic and health disparity issues that exist, right? So we think about majority of people of color are essential workers. Majority of people of color do not have access to healthcare. Majority of people of color do not have the same access to education. And like I like to say on the podcast, and one of the things that's really important for us in incorporating Black culture in the way that we talk about things is that the language itself, the language of genetics, the words that we use, the way that we talk about it, the way that scientists talk about science has been extremely uninclusive. And I don't even just mean that from a race perspective, but we have to make sure that when we talk about these things, as they impact so many of us, that we are being inclusive all the way down to the language that we use and the ways that we describe. And so in this talk, you heard me give various analogies and descriptions of trying to understand these very complex science concepts, but really making them accessible to everyone. Because when we're in a pandemic like where we're in right now, it's increasingly important that we do that, so that we all benefit, because as we have all learned, we are in this pandemic together. So I talked about yellow fever and this idea that yellow fever, Black people were immune to yellow fever. We did reporting for COVID-19 under that same guise that was happening, this misinformation that Black people were immune to COVID-19. The other thing that has happened more recently, and we did this reporting last year, while the vaccines were in development, is that a lot of people in my community started to express that they were afraid to take the vaccine because the vaccine could be targeted to alter your DNA, and specifically alter the DNA of Black people. And so I'm going to play this last clip to kind of show you guys how we do our reporting to really, really talk about with detail and compassion and concern, because none of any vaccine hesitant person has reasons why they're vaccine hesitant. And those reasons should not be dismissed. Those reasons should not be judged. Those reasons should be taken with concern and compassion, and should be explained with the same level of love and care, because we are all in this together. And so I'm going to play this clip from that episode that really kind of talks about the possibility of the vaccine altering your DNA, and how we basically take information that's miscommunicated and change it, report facts.
Is it possible for scientists to create a vaccine engineered to specifically harm one group of people? In this case, Black people. This is similar to the myth we debunked about scientists creating coronavirus in the lab to do harm. In short, SARS-CoV-2 has over 30,000 letters in its genome, or book of genetic instructions. And what makes SARS-CoV-2 unique compared to the original SARS, the virus responsible for the 2002-2004 outbreak, varies only by a random shuffling of about 1,000 letters. The shuffle is so random that it's nearly impossible to orchestrate. Even if you wanted to create a deadly virus, let's say to hurt people, you probably want to go with something better than one where over 80% of cases just get flu symptoms and a loss of taste and smell. Ba-bum-bum. Psh. All right. Let's apply this same logic to the vaccine that will be engineered to kill us theory. When it comes to creating a bioweapon disguised as a vaccine, the genome will be equally important. Making a bioweapon that only targets one group of people who vary so much genetically is even more impossible and illogical. In order to develop a bioweapon that would specifically cause harm to Black folks and Black folks only, one would need to understand the interaction between coronavirus and the genomes of Black folk. And here's the thing. There is very little known about how coronavirus interacts with anyone's genome. Furthermore, because of actual systemic racism, very little is known about Black genomes in the first place. We can't even get medical treatments that work properly for us. So who in the hell got the research to create a bioweapon against us? We also know that, sadly, there are much easier ways of killing Black folks. It's our lived experience. The socioeconomic factors like poverty, increased stress, lack of access to healthy food and air are the bioweapons working against us. And they're not the same covert diabolic plan. They're right there for everyone to see and for us to experience.
So that was a little bit heavy. I ask myself all the time, how can we have a field that is so deeply rooted in systemic racism? Where do we go from here? How can we change? Will racism always exist? Once it's created, can we uncreate it? And so I asked in this last clip on this first episode of How the World Inherited Blackness, I asked that very question.
Given all that history, how should we engage with genetics, given what we know about it being fundamentally built from racist ideologies?
I think that we first and foremost should not shy away from acknowledging exactly that, constantly reflecting on the ways that it still informs, shapes, and contours how we operate today.
It's also about understanding that we're more complex than simple scientific measurements.
We should hold genetics in tandem with the other ways of thinking about how we understand ourselves. How do we think of the biological alongside of the cultural understandings and conceptions that we've always had? You know, how might you think about a genetic ancestry test alongside your family's oral histories?
And so I say all that to say that one of the most important things that we have to do as we go out and we advocate for the community is when we have to listen and we have to expand all realms of possibility with an open heart and really listen to the other side. And so I hope I conveyed that. I hope everyone learned today. I also hope, and I want to also welcome you to be a part of the family in which we call our listeners. You've listened to a considerable amount of the podcast today. I really appreciate you for listening. And I'm so flattered to be invited here. And I just want to say thank you. So here's my information. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, here's a link of where you can listen to the podcast. You can follow us on Twitter. You can also follow us on Instagram with the same handle. And I know I said I was going to leave 30 minutes for questions, and now I realize we only have 10 minutes for questions. But I really do want to kind of open this up and answer your questions and just have a conversation. I would love to hear, what your thoughts are about genetic ancestry testing, what your thoughts are about the field of genetics, what your thoughts are about the vaccine. I mean, really, this is an open forum for you guys to just, be in community with me and me to be in community with you. So thank you.
Everyone, if you would please type your questions into the chat box, and then I will relay them to Janina. Janina, thank you so much. It's really, so much information, really deep and important stuff. And I'm hoping that there's going to be lots of questions. I have lots of questions. There's one person already mentioned that there was a recently released report of federal dereliction of duty that discusses the impacts of previous EPA suspension of enforcement of environmental protection policies harmed BIPOC communities' health because of increased pollution in environmental justice communities, and how the increased exposure to pollution during the COVID pandemic increased the health risks and outcomes in BIPOC communities. So that's more of a comment. Here's a question. What are your thoughts, if any, regarding GFR differences for African Americans with chronic kidney disease?
Yeah, so I do want to comment on the first part, because the environmental concerns actually has kind of trickled down into genetics, particularly when we talk about asthma. When I was in graduate school, a lot of scientists, some of my favorite scientists, were all interested in understanding the genetics of asthma, because we saw a correlation with Native American ancestry and developing asthma. And for a long time, geneticists believed that it was connected to genetic ancestry. And one of the biggest, a term that we call in genetics is called population stratification, which is this idea that a population share a given medical phenotype, in this case, asthma, that it must be connected to their most recent common ancestor, in this case, Native Americans. When we talk about population stratification, though, that is the hypothesis that it's something due to the ancestry. But a lot of times it's hard to prove that. And in fact, when you think about something like climate change and environmental discrimination, we actually realize that this group of people who are experiencing this condition, in this case, asthma, has nothing to do with them having a shared common ancestor. It has everything to do with them having a shared environment. And that environment is then, impacted by environmental racism. And so I think one thing that's happening right now in our field is we're trying to shift to understand, okay, what is due to genetic ancestry and what is due to racism? And can we disentangle the two? And so it's a really hard question. I'm actually want to write about it. So I'll keep you guys posted. If I ever get honored enough to come back, I would love to get an update on that. EGFR, so chronic kidney disease, is a big one in terms of trying to understand that very question. is this something that is due to genetic ancestry, or is this something that is due to a shared environment or an experience, a lived experience? So when I was in my postdoc, we studied a gene. There's a gene called APOL1, and APOL1 and EGFR are related. And so if you have certain variation in this gene, APOL1, you have increased EGFR that can lead to chronic kidney disease, right? And so in medical practice, they actually have, when you go in to get a EGFR test and you get your creatinine levels tested for your kidney function, there actually is an adjusted function for people of African descent. And that adjusted function is built off of the hypothesis, before we even knew about genetics, that Black people were experiencing at a disproportionate level more chronic kidney disease than their other counterparts. And so this actually, and another example of this is sickle cell. This actually is an example where genetic ancestry is explaining the phenotype, or at least part of the phenotype. So I'll use sickle cell as an example. The same thing exists with EGFR and chronic kidney disease, where there are variants in the genome that do lead to, for example, sickle cell developing sickle cell. Now, what the story is that we talk about what is genetic ancestry and what is shared environment. In this case, yes, your common ancestors in the context of developing sickle cell do have a mutation that causes their red blood cells to have this sickle shape. But that mutation came about because of an environmental change. These people live close to the equator. And by living close to the equator, they were exposed to mosquitoes, and mosquitoes carries diseases. And so if you have a more recent common ancestor like me and many other Black Americans from West Africa, you know that our ancestors are close to the equator, and therefore they had to live, before we had technology, they had to survive, you know, these harsh diseases that were being carried by mosquitoes, and one of them was malaria. And so one of the beautiful things about the human body, and particularly about genetics, when we have something in our environment that is causing the population to die, our genomes will quickly evolve and create a mutation to stop it, because we want to live, right? And so in the context of sickle cell, the mutation was created because if you had these sickle cell shaped red blood cells, it prevented you from developing malaria. And so while sickle cell, people who have sickle cell, you know, experience a lot of other medical conditions, now that, you know, we are an evolved population with all of this technology, we don't have to worry about mosquitoes and malaria as much. You get sickle cell. And sickle cell, again, could lead to a much shorter life then. But back then, when our ancestors were battling with malaria, living to be 40 was a big accomplishment, when, you know, people were dying very young of malaria. And so this is what we like to call natural selection, where your body in your genome is evolving for the benefit of your survival. And the same hypothesis also applies for APOL1 and EGFR and chronic kidney disease. And so I would say that is tied to genetic ancestry, but at the same time, it's also very much so tied to the environment and tied to the environment you live in. And so I am by no means saying that race or genetic ancestry explain this phenotype, but I am saying that your shared common ancestor lived in an environment that caused the mutation to occur.
There's a couple of questions here regarding genetic testing, and I'm going to sort of group them together a little bit. So number one, is it even worth getting genetic testing? Do genetic testing companies retain the DNA? And how easy is it for police to access DNA information through these companies?
Yes. So I'm gonna also plug the podcast, because we address all these topics in the podcast, and I'll tell you what episodes to listen to. So let me get to your first question. Should we do genetic, and is it worth doing it? That's a personal decision. I think it depends on what you're doing it for. For me, I tell people all the time, know everything you need to know about it before you make that decision. Because I think one thing that a lot of people don't understand, when you do genetic ancestry testing, you are also putting your relatives' information into these databases. And I personally, you know, you might have a relative who may not want that. You might learn some things you may not want to know. So just fully understand what information you're going to get, How accurate is the information? Is it going to impact the way you live your life? There are a lot of positives though. You know, a lot of these companies are getting better and better at predicting disease, which I think is the biggest positive. A lot of the companies are also, when we talk about people finding relatives, I don't know what it's like to not know my blood relatives. So I don't think I have the authority to speak on that decision for someone who doesn't know. And so I do think that there's a lot of value, and those are very accurate. So the accuracy there for ancestry and the accuracy, well, let me say that the accuracy for finding your relatives is very, very, very accurate. When we're talking about genetic ancestry, it depends on how you define that. So there is no way to 100% predict for a person like myself, who is African American, that my ancestor is definitely Ghanaian, because there's so much mixing in evolution and in traveling and things that have happened with human populations. It's impossible to trace that unless you have information on every single individual in the world. And we don't have that. And even if we did have that, it would be very difficult to understand it. I always ask people, when we think about these identity questions and wanting to be tied to a tribe, you know, in this particular part of the world, we have to ask ourselves why. We have to ask ourselves, why do we need to pick one tribe? Well, if we're actually a mix of all, we should be celebrating them all. So we should be celebrating all of these cultures, because there is no hierarchy, right? We should be re-emphasizing how important it is to celebrate everyone. The other question you asked was about what happens to the data. Every company has, and I referenced this in one of the clips, T's and C's. If you go and listen to episode 4 is an episode we do with our elders. And so it highlights a bunch of my family in New Orleans, all 75 plus, 75 or 80 plus, and talking about privacy concerns and talking about what are the things you need to know? What are the things you should understand about privacy? And so I tell people there are different companies that do different things. So there's an African ancestry. They don't have really accurate ancestry testing because they only use 0.2% of the genome, but they discard all DNA samples and they don't keep any DNA. You also have companies like 23andMe. 23andMe is most known recently for selling their data set to a pharmaceutical company for $300 million. Now you might think about, these people are paying 23andMe to tell them data, and we know it's not 100% accurate, and 23andMe is selling that data. And you might probably already know this, that the people who donated their data or paid to donate their data did not get any type of money from that sale, right? So you have to understand that, like, how do you feel about that? They do have access to your data. In all of them, you can decide to not share access, and they, you know, use it for research. So you can say, I actually don't want my data to be used for research, so I would prefer not to. When it comes to, so that's just things that you should know. So some companies throw away, most companies do keep them. And if you consent to genetic research, you will not be able to kind of like go back. You can change it, but once they do something like a sale, your data's already in there. The thing about the FBI and government being able to access your data, they have to get a warrant in order to access it. I think a lot of people think about the Golden State Killer and they're like, oh no, like what if there's a serial killer in my family and I do this test and they find a serial killer? Believe it or not, majority of the FBI going through these genetic ancestry companies are doing it for nonviolent crimes. And unfortunately, those nonviolent crimes typically target Black and brown people. And so we're talking about people who are delinquent on taxes or property taxes. We're talking about people who might have done scamming or, you know, petty crimes, I would say. And well, I don't know. I don't want to say petty crimes, but nonviolent crimes. And majority of the time when they get a warrant to go through these databases, it's for that versus like rape cases or murder cases. The government, most of the companies will grant access. It's not exactly easy though. They do have to come with a warrant, and it has to be quite detailed. From what I understand of all of the companies, the one that has been the most stringent on this is 23andMe. And Ancestry is a close second. When we talk about the Golden State Killer, that was a completely different company, not a well-known company in which they found them. So different companies have different guidelines, but yes, the government can have access to your DNA through these companies.
All right. Well, there are a couple more questions, but we're kind of out of time. So I do want to keep to roughly to our hour, and want to thank you so much. This was highly interesting. And I would like to recommend to all of you that you go and listen to the podcast. If you'd like to unmute yourself and start, giving your thanks and praises, please do that. I've posted the podcast and Janina shared it also on her screen. And it is absolutely fascinating. I find this subject to be incredibly interesting and illuminating. And I do hope that this kind of information and research finds its way into and infiltrates modern medicine to such a degree that it's taken into consideration in the research and care, of Black and Brown people, as well as white people, so that it's a more broad-reaching, wide-reaching kind of approach than it has been. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a great night.
You too.
So
Thank you.
much.
I asked the GFR question. Your answer was incredible. Thank you so much.
No problem. I'm glad it helped.
And everybody, we're going to have Dr. Otis Brawley on the 12th of October. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.